The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease had gone soft as cloth, and Elsa Norden was still holding it in her coat pocket. Still turning it over with 2 fingers like a woman, checking a stove to see if it's really gone cold. When the train pulled into Larkspur Hollow, and the whole town turned to look at her before she'd even set both boots on the platform. She was 34 years old, from a stretch of coastline in the old country that nobody in Nebraska could have found on a map. And she had crossed an ocean and half a continent to answer a letter from a woman she had never met. My name doesn't matter yet, hers does. Because what happened to Elsa Norden in the 4 months that followed is the kind of thing you don't believe when someone tells it to you straight. A house that wasn't supposed to want her. A child who wasn't supposed to speak to her, and a man who wasn't supposed to need anything from anybody. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a jar of sourdough starter that had survived 19 days at sea did something none of them expected. It started to feel like home. Noon in Larkspur Hollow was never a quiet hour, and that particular Tuesday was no exception. The grain merchant was leaned up against the water barrel arguing feed prices with the postmaster. 2 women from the Ladies' Aid Society had stationed themselves near the depot steps, with the studied casualness of people who wanted to witness everything and be seen witnessing nothing. A boy of about 8 sat on an upended crate, swinging his legs, watching the passenger car with the frank, unembarrassed attention only children are still allowed to have. The door opened. Elsa stepped down with a suitcase in her right hand and nothing at all in her left. She was not young in the way that draws easy sympathy from a town, and she was not old enough to be waved off as harmless either. She was somewhere in that particular decade of a woman's life, where the hard choices have already been made and now live in the set of her jaw instead of on her face. Her coat was good gray wool, but it had been let out at the seams and taken back in more than once, carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing, but more than once all the same. Her boots were dry. She had packed for arriving somewhere, not for the getting there. She stood on the platform a moment and studied the main street the way you study a map you've already memorized in your head, but are finally seeing the actual ground of for the first time, measuring. Distances. Correcting for what the paper hadn't shown her. The grain merchant's conversation slowed without quite stopping. The postmaster's eyes drifted to the platform and away again, too quick to be caught at it. One of the Ladies' Aid women murmured something to the other, pitched for an audience of exactly 1, and the other nodded in the particular way that means we'll finish this indoors over tea. Where it's warmer, the boy kept swinging his legs. Elsa had a letter. She'd had it out and open before the train had even fully stopped, and now she folded it by feel without looking and slid it back into her coat pocket. The address she wanted was 3 buildings east of the depot. She'd memorized that from the correspondence weeks ago on the ship in the dark, when there had been nothing else to do but recite it to herself like a psalm. She counted the storefronts as she walked, a general mercantile, a narrow building with no sign she could read yet, a farrier's by the smell and the ring of the hammer. The dust of Larkspur Hollow's Main Street in October was the fine kind, the kind that has been walked over and ridden over and driven over so many thousand times that it's given up having any texture at all and simply become part of the air you breathe. It filmed the boardwalk pale gray. Her boots left 2 clean prints going east. The suitcase was not light. She didn't shift it to her other arm, didn't set it down to rest. What was in it exactly? She hadn't told anyone. There had been no one left by then to tell. A change of clothes. A tin of buttons sorted by size out of habit more than need. A small ceramic crock with a hairline crack in the lid, wrapped in her second-best skirt so it wouldn't knock against anything. And a recipe book in her mother's handwriting, in a language that hadn't been spoken in this town in living memory. Here's what nobody on that platform knew yet, including Elsa herself. That crock in her suitcase was about to become the reason a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words a day since March started leaving his workshop door unlocked. The building with no sign had a door set back slightly from the boardwalk. Recessed into the frame the way a house looks when it's exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. There was a window to the left of it, clean enough that she could see her own reflection, a dark column of a woman with a suitcase hanging off one arm. She didn't study it long. She knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps, not hurried, not dragging, the footsteps of a man who saw no reason to change his pace just because someone was waiting on the other side of a door. The man who opened it was somewhere past 30, with sawdust ground into the crease of his left forearm and an expression that wasn't unfriendly and wasn't welcoming either. It was simply open, the way a door is open before you know what's going to walk through it. He took her in the way a person reads whether quickly, without ceremony, filing away what mattered. She gave her name. She gave the name of the woman who'd written to her, Agnes Whitlock. She said she'd been told there was a room and work to go with it. He looked at the suitcase. He looked past her at the empty street. Then he said the room was above the kitchen, and that the woman she was asking after had been his mother, and that his mother had died in September. Elsa held that. She didn't flinch, and she didn't rush to fill the silence with an apology that wouldn't have meant anything anyway. She asked, instead, if the room was still available. He was quiet a beat too long for it to be about trust. She'd understand that later, that he wasn't deciding whether to believe her. He was thinking about the room itself, which had been his mother's before it had ever been a spare room, and which nobody had gone into since the bed had been stripped. He said yes. She followed him in. The front of the building was a carpenter's shop. Sawhorses, planks stacked along the near wall, the smell of cedar shavings and something underneath it, resin or linseed oil. She couldn't yet tell which. A narrow staircase ran up the back. At the top, a short hallway and a door that stuck at the bottom where the frame had swelled with damp. He shouldered it open. The room was small. A bed, a chest, a window that looked out over the alley and past that. Open country that started abruptly where the last building on the east side of town simply gave up and let the prairie take over. The light coming through was flat and gray and entirely honest. He said board and wages if she could cook. He said there was a kitchen off the workshop he hadn't made much use of. He didn't ask what she knew how to make. He went back down the stairs. She heard him cross the shop floor, and then the long, steady rasp of a hand plane starting up again against wood, as though she hadn't interrupted a single thing in his day. She stood at the window after his footsteps faded. The prairie beyond the alley was the color of dry grass, pale and even, running out to a ridge she didn't have a name for yet. She hadn't seen that much open sky in a long time. Back home there had always been something standing in the way of it. She unpacked without hurrying. 3 dresses, a wool shawl, 2 aprons. A tin of needles and thread, a slim book with a cracked spine she didn't open yet, and at the bottom, wrapped so it wouldn't shift, the ceramic crock, sealed with wax and cloth. Her mother's sourdough, kept alive through 6 weeks of travel by feeding it every second day with whatever flour she could find, in a galley kitchen on a wagon seat. In a hotel room she'd shared with 3 strangers in Chicago. She set the crock on top of the chest and looked at it a moment before going down to find the kitchen. It was a narrow room running along the back of the workshop, separated from the sawing and planing by a thin wall she could hear straight through. A cast-iron stove, cold. A hand pump over a shallow basin. Shelves with flour, cornmeal, salt, a tin of lard, a handful of dried beans that had clearly sat there long enough to have gone pale and forgotten. 1 pot, 2 skillets, one of the skillets warped at the handle. She lit the stove and let it take its time. She'd cooked in worse. She'd cooked in a ship's galley on a crossing that took 19 days and left half the passengers unable to look at a horizon line without their stomachs turning over. She'd cooked in her aunt's house in a city where the gas ran thin come winter, and you learned to manage a flame carefully or you went cold and hungry both. She knew how to build something out of almost nothing, and she knew that the first meal in a new house mattered, not because it needed to be remarkable, but because it told the truth about what kind of cook you were, whether you meant it to or not. She found an onion in a sack by the door, 3 potatoes still firm, a knuckle of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She worked without trying to make conversation through the partition wall, didn't announce what she was doing, just let the smell of it travel where it wanted. The bread would have to wait a day. The starter needed time to wake up properly after the journey. But she uncovered the crock, fed it a spoonful of flour and a splash of water, and set it near the back of the stove where the warmth was gentle instead of fierce. By the time the stew was ready, the light through the 1 small window had gone the color of ash. She set 2 bowls on the work table without calling out, waited, then crossed to the partition and knocked twice with a knuckle, not loud. A knock that said, "When you're ready." Not now, the plane stopped. A stool scraped, footsteps. The door between the workshop and the kitchen opened, and he stood in the frame looking at the bowls, then at her, then at the bowls again. Wood shavings dusted his hands. His face was a closed, straight thing, not unkind. Just a face that had learned a long time ago not to offer anything before it knew what was actually being asked of it. He crossed to the basin and washed without being told to. She sat. He sat across from her. He picked up the spoon and ate. She watched the first mouthful the way she always did, not for a reaction to flatter herself with, but because that first bite told her whether the salt had landed right, whether the onion had gone long enough over the heat. He didn't look up from the bowl. He ate steadily without comment. She ate too. Outside, Larkspur Hollow's main street was going dark by degrees. Someone crossed at the far end of it with a lantern. A dog barked once and got no answer. She'd kept the stew simple on purpose. There hadn't been much choice in it, but she'd have made the same choice regardless. A cook who tries to impress on the first night is a cook who doesn't trust her own ingredients. She trusted hers. Halfway through, he tore a piece of hardtack from the tin above the shelf and used it to wipe the bottom of the bowl clean. She'd watched her father do exactly that. She'd watched men in 3 different countries do exactly that. She glanced at the crock near the back of the stove. By morning, it would have started properly. By the second day, she'd know for certain whether the travel had weakened it past saving, or whether it had come through whole. She'd kept it alive across 6 weeks and 2 oceans and the width of a continent. She wasn't anxious about the answer. She just wanted to know it. He finished and set the spoon down. She expected him to stand. He didn't. He sat with both hands flat on the table, the way a man sits when he's decided to stay another minute, not because there's anything left to say, but because getting up too fast would be its own kind of rudeness he hadn't meant. She didn't fill the quiet for him. After a while he said, "Where'd you learn?" Not "that was good," not "thank you." Just the plain question stripped down to what was necessary. The way some men strip everything down to the bone before they'll let it out of their mouths. "My mother," she said, "and a woman in Bergen who ran a boarding house." He nodded once, stood, and carried his own bowl to the basin. But here's the thing about a man like Silas Whitlock, and Elsa was only starting to learn this. The ones who say the least are usually the ones keeping the most locked up behind their teeth. And what he wasn't saying yet, that first night, was that there was a 5-year-old girl asleep down the hall who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since March. He was up before first light. She heard the back step, the third one down, which had its own particular creak, lower and rounder than the others, and then the barn door dragging against ground that had already started to freeze. She lay still a minute longer, then got up. The crock was where she'd left it. She lifted the cloth. The surface had begun to shift, faintly, barely visible in the gray early light, but there. It had come through the crossing hole. She covered it again and put the kettle on. By the time he came in from the barn, she had coffee ready and yesterday's bread out with butter from the cold box. He hung his coat on the peg without glancing at the table. When he turned and saw the coffee waiting, he paused, just a beat, then sat. She stood at the window while he drank. The valley below was white under a white sky. A line of cottonwoods marked where the creek ran, and past them, the outline of a ridge she still had no name for. She'd been quietly naming things since she arrived. The ridge, the dry gully to the east, a rock formation near the road that from a distance looked like a man sitting with his knees drawn up. She named places privately in every town she'd ever passed through. It helped her keep track of where exactly she was. He finished his coffee, stood, and went back out without a word. That was the shape of the mornings she came to understand. Not unfriendly, just efficient. He had work, she had work. Whatever talking there was going to be would happen later, or it wouldn't happen at all. She started the bread. Starter first, then flour, then water brought to the right temperature by feel, the way her hands had done it 1,000 times without needing instruction. She pressed the heel of her palm into the dough and felt it push back, not enough give yet, still too soft, and kept working. By mid-morning, the kitchen held the smell of it. She'd propped the door open for air, and cold crept in low along the floorboards the way cold always does, meeting the stove's warmth somewhere around her ankles. There was a particular quality to that mixed temperature, cold below, warm above, that pulled her straight back to her mother's kitchen, in a house she hadn't stood inside in 11 years. She didn't let herself sit with that too long. She shaped the loaves, set them near the stove to rise, and went to check the crock again. It moved now, quietly, steadily, the way something living moves once it's finally found its footing after a long, hard trip. Behind the barn, she could hear him at the fence line, the mallet coming down, a pause, the mallet again, even spacing, the same unhurried rhythm he brought to everything he touched. The sound had settled into the background of her morning so completely that she only noticed it when it stopped. A few minutes of silence, then boots on the porch steps. 2 knocks on the open door before he came in, coat damp at the shoulders. He looked at the loaves rising near the stove and said nothing about them, just crossed to the basin and pumped water over his hands. She asked if he wanted coffee. He said he did. She poured it, set the cup down, went back to the crock. The cloth had lifted at one corner from the pressure building underneath. She pressed it flat again with 2 fingers. He sat with the cup between both palms, studying the kitchen, the way a man studies something he's trying to understand without ever quite asking about it out loud. After a while, he said the fence along the north pasture had been sitting wrong since August, and he should have gotten to it before the ground froze solid. She said she'd been wondering why the cattle kept drifting off. He looked up at that. She kept her eyes on the crock and didn't elaborate. He drank slowly. The loaves had begun pressing against the cloth she'd draped over them, dough swelling into the weave. He watched that without comment. "Smell of that is something," he said finally. "Needs another hour," she said. "I've got time." She didn't look at him. She took the bread paddle down off its hook and turned it over in her hands from habit, checking the grain, and found a long, shallow crack along the handle she hadn't noticed before. She ran a thumbnail down the length of it. He saw her stop. "I could fix that," he said. "It's fine. Split clean through by spring, left like that." She set it on the table in front of him without arguing further. He turned it over, ran his own thumb down the crack the same way she had, and set it aside without another word. She refilled his cup without being asked. He acknowledged it with nothing more than a small shift of his hands, making room for the fresh warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up, working under the gap beneath the door, changing the way the stove breathed. Somewhere out on the property, a board or a gate latch knocked once and went still. He heard it too, and she watched him already calculating what it was and what it would take to fix. He stood without announcing it, pulled his coat on in the same sequence he always did, left side, then right, then the collar turned down flat, 10,000 times over. By the look of it, and lifted the bread paddle off the table, tucking it under his arm. "You don't have to do that tonight," she said. "Wind's already up, won't get better waiting." She didn't argue. She understood the logic of a man who fixed small things before they turned into larger ones. She'd married a man like that once. She'd buried him, too. She knew the type the way you know weather, not from what it says about itself, but from how it moves through a room. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch, then on the frozen ground, then nothing as the wind took the sound away entirely. She cleared the cups, wiped the table, laid the cloth back over the dough that would need one more rise before morning. The kitchen settled around her the way an empty house does, not lonely exactly, but aware of its own quiet. Through the window she could see the workshop lamp, a still yellow rectangle against the dark and the moving grass. He'd lit it without her seeing him do it, which meant he'd carried matches out with him, which meant he'd planned on staying a while. She didn't quite know what to do with that thought. She sat with the mending basket. 3 of his shirts were folded at the bottom of it, left at the back door the week before with no note and no instruction. Just the silent assumption that this, too, was something she did now. She didn't mind. She was good with a needle and had no quarrel with the work. But she sat with the first shirt across her lap and didn't thread the needle right away. She looked at the lamp instead. She'd been careful with herself since the day she arrived, the way you're careful with something that's already been broken once and mended, and might not hold a second time. She hadn't let herself read too much into a cup of coffee, or a fixed hinge, or the way he always seemed to know she was low on wood before she knew it herself. But a man who carries matches out to his workshop at night because he's already decided he's staying, that isn't nothing. She threaded the needle and made the first stitch on the cuff, where the fabric had frayed clean through. Outside, the lamp held steady despite the wind, which meant the shutters were angled correctly, which meant he knew this property the way you only know a place after years of paying attention to it. She kept her eyes on the shirt and made the stitches small and even. The next morning he was gone before she came down. The lamp outside had gone cold. The shutters had been set back to their open position, the way she kept them in fair weather, and she stood in the doorway a moment, noting the change. He'd seen the difference and put it back the way she had it. She made coffee, set out one cup without thinking, caught herself, and left it out anyway. The shirt was finished. She'd sat with it well past 10 the night before, making the stitches smaller than they strictly needed to be, which was what her hands did when her mind was working through something and needed somewhere to put its hands. She folded it and left it on the workbench by the door. She hadn't put a price on the mending because he hadn't asked for one, and she didn't quite know how to start. Mid-morning brought Mrs. Odell from the general store in for a fitting. Mrs. Odell talked the way she always did, easily and about everything at once, and somewhere near the end of it she mentioned, lightly, as though it were nothing at all, that she'd seen the deputy crossing the street toward the workshop 2 evenings running. Elsa kept her eyes on the hem she was pinning. "He brought wood," she said. Mrs. Odell said nothing to that, which was its own kind of comment. After she left, the shop went quiet. Low afternoon light came through the front window and landed on the folded shirt on the workbench. Elsa looked at it a moment, then went back to her work. This is the part of the story people always ask me about later, because a fixed hinge and a folded shirt don't sound like much of anything, do they? But in a house where nobody says what they mean out loud, this is exactly how two people fall in love. One small repaired thing at a time. He came by near 4 that afternoon and knocked once, which he didn't always do. She called him in. He crossed to the workbench, saw the shirt and picked it up, turned it over, studied the cuff where she'd mended it. She kept working. "You didn't have to do the whole cuff," he said. "Thread wouldn't have held otherwise." He turned it over again, set it down, then picked it back up and folded it a second time, more carefully than before. The way a person handles something they intend on keeping. He didn't say anything else about it. He tucked it under his arm and stood there a moment, in the particular stillness he had when he was deciding whether to go or stay. "There's coffee if it's still warm," she said. He checked the pot, said it was, poured 1 cup, not 2, and drank it standing at the counter. She worked. Neither of them made conversation, and the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It had started to feel, instead, like something they'd agreed to without ever discussing it out loud. He brought wood the next day, and the day after that. He stacked it along the west wall of the shed where it would stay driest, and she hadn't told him to do it that way. He'd simply looked at the shed. Looked at the direction the weather was coming from off the ridge, and stacked it there without a word. The days had shortened considerably by then. By 4 in the afternoon, the light had gone thin and amber. By 5, it was simply gone. She'd started keeping a candle on the workbench, so she could finish through the early dark without straining her eyes. A plain tallow candle from the mercantile, nothing special about it, but she'd fallen into lighting it at the same time each evening. And that small consistency had turned itself into a kind of ritual. The match, the catch of flame, the particular smell of it, then the return to work. He came in one evening and found it already lit. He looked at it without comment, poured his coffee, stood at the counter the way he always did. She was working on a child's coat, the seam at one shoulder torn out entirely, rebuilding it from the inside. He watched her a moment, not intrusively, the way you might watch a fire burn, then looked away. "Josie talked today," she said, a whole sentence she meant. He went very still. "What'd she say?" She asked where you were. He set the cup down, picked it back up. She didn't look at him, but she heard the pause sitting inside his stillness. "What you tell her? That you'd be back?" Another silence. He finished the coffee. The candle flame moved in some draft she couldn't place. "She's talking more," he said finally. "I noticed. She didn't used to." He stopped himself there. She kept working and let the quiet sit with him, gave him room to finish it or not. "Been a while since she did," he said. She didn't fill that either. She let it stand in the room where it needed to stand. After a moment, he mentioned a loose board in the floor of the back room. He could fix it Saturday if she didn't mind the noise. She said that would be fine. He pulled his coat on and was at the door when she said, "She asked me something else too." He stopped. She asked if you were going to stay. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe, not turning around. I didn't know what to tell her, Elsa said. He was quiet long enough that the candle flame moved again before he answered. Tell her I'll be back tomorrow with the wood. He went out. She listened to his boots cross the porch, and then she listened to the quiet that came after. She stood at the counter a long time, hand flat against the wood, looking at nothing in particular. Then she straightened, blew out the candle, and went to bed. And here's where I have to tell you something that made this whole story worth writing down in the first place, because Josie Whitlock hadn't lost her mother to illness. The way half the town assumed. That's a story for a little further on. But it's the reason a 5-year-old girl went 8 months without saying more than yes and no to her own father. And it's the reason what happened next mattered so much more than a bowl of soup and a fixed floorboard ever should have. Saturday came in gray and cold. Elsa was up before the light, same as always. Stove fed and coffee started before she even heard him out in the yard. She didn't go to the window. She heard the axe and the pause and the axe again, a steady rhythm filling the quiet the way weather fills a valley, not intruding, just present. Josie was still asleep. Elsa mixed the dough, left it to rise, and started the morning's bread. When Boots hit the porch steps, she didn't look up from the board. He knocked once and came in with the cold still on him, coat dark at the shoulders from the damp. The wood stack was done, he said. She said the coffee was ready. He poured it himself and mentioned, over the rim of the cup, that the backboard needed a different nail than what he'd brought. He'd have the right size by Tuesday. Josie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose and tangled from sleep. She looked at her father, then at the kitchen, then at the bread dough on the counter. Are we making something? She asked. We are, Elsa said, and handed her the small wooden spoon that was just the right size for a 5-year-old's hand. Josie climbed onto the stepstool without being asked. Silas watched this. He didn't say anything, but Elsa felt him watching it all the same. The three of them were quiet together in that kitchen a while, Josie stirring something she'd soon declare finished, the dough rising under its cloth, the stove ticking as it settled into its heat. Outside, the sky had gone the color of old tin, snow coming maybe by afternoon. At some point, Josie stopped stirring and looked up at her father. She makes everything good, she said. I know it, he said. Do you like it here? He looked down at her, then across the kitchen to the window. Yes, he said, just the one word. Josie seemed entirely satisfied with that and went back to stirring. Elsa pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. Silas was still standing by the stove. The snow started before noon, small and quiet, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates while you're busy doing something else. It had already covered the fresh wood stack by the time anyone thought to look outside. She served the bread warm at midday, cut while it was still steaming, laid out on the board without ceremony. Josie took her piece with both hands and didn't set it down until it was gone. Silas ate standing at the counter the way he had that first week, and the second, and now still, though she'd noticed without ever mentioning it. That he'd been drifting a little closer to the table each time, the distance closing on its own without either of them deciding it out loud. The snow kept coming, patient and unbothered, the way it did in this part of the country. Elsa stood at the window once while the bread was still being eaten and looked out at the empty road. The cottonwood at the far end of the lot had gone white along its top branches. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to before turning back. He was watching Josie finish her bread. The girl had crumbs on her collar and no interest whatsoever in doing anything about it. She asked if there'd be more tomorrow. Elsa said yes. Josie nodded like she'd just been handed a piece of very important news. After the meal, Silas put on his coat, said he'd bring in more wood before the storm settled in properly. Elsa said that was a good idea. He pulled the door shut behind him and she heard his boots on the steps and then nothing but the snow. She washed the board. She washed the knife. Josie carried the cups to the basin without being asked, which was a thing she'd started doing sometime in the last few weeks. Elsa couldn't have said exactly when it had begun. At some point, she found herself standing in the middle of the kitchen with nothing in her hands. She hadn't done that in a long time, stopped without a task, just stood in the middle of a room and let the quiet hold her a minute. She could hear him outside, the dull knock of the axe against the splitting block, steady and unhurried, the same rhythm he brought to everything. Josie had drifted to the window seat with a length of string. She was working into something complicated, talking quietly to herself the way children do when they've forgotten anyone else is in the room. The splitting block went quiet. A moment passed. Then the sound of wood being stacked against the side of the house, log by log, building up. Elsa checked the stove's heat. She knew the sound of his boots on the top step well enough by now to know when he was almost to the door. It opened the way it always did, a pause at the threshold while he knocked the worst of the mud off against the step, then in. She didn't turn around. She heard him set something down on the bench near the door, heard the weight of his coat come off. Heard the particular quiet of a man who'd learned to move through a room without disturbing the air in it any more than necessary. Josie said something from the window seat without looking up from her string. He answered her in that same low, plain voice he always used with her, as though her questions deserved real consideration, not the half-attention most grown men gave a small child. Elsa had noticed that early on. He didn't speak down to his daughter. He spoke across to her like an equal. Elsa ladled soup into the bowl she'd already set out and carried it to the table. He sat. He didn't say it smelled good the way some men did out of habit. He simply sat down and picked up the spoon, and she'd learned by now that the compliment was in the sitting, in the staying. She sat across from him. Josie abandoned her string and climbed into her own chair. They ate the way they'd been eating together for weeks now, not silent exactly, but without performance. Josie talked when she had something worth saying. They answered when there was something worth answering. The fire held its own quiet conversation with the draft under the door. At some point, Elsa looked up and found him looking at her. Not quickly, not away again right after. He held it a moment, the way a person holds something they've learned to be careful with. Then he looked back down at his bowl. She set her spoon down. She didn't say anything. There was nothing yet that needed saying out loud. But she reached across the table and moved the bread board an inch closer to his side, for no particular reason at all, and he broke off a piece without comment. And that was all it was. And that was enough. The candle on the shelf had been burning in one form or another since October. She'd set it there when the cold first came in earnest, meaning to move it somewhere more sensible later. She never had. It burned down and she replaced it twice, without making a thing of it, without quite admitting to herself that she'd done it on purpose. Tonight it threw its small, ordinary light across the shelf, and the wall, and the faces of the two people at the table, and the child between them who was in the middle of telling a long, winding story about something that had happened at school that week, a story with no clear ending and no need of one. The fire settled low in the stove. Outside, the wind came in off the open country and moved around the corners of the house the way it had all winter, looking for a way inside. It didn't find one. Elsa Norden came to Larkspur Hollow, answering a dead woman's letter, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a jar of starter that had somehow survived an ocean. She didn't come looking for a family. She came looking for a wage and a room and maybe, if she was honest with herself on the ship at night, a place where nobody already knew the shape of her grief. What she found instead was a girl who slowly remembered how to talk, and a man who said almost nothing and meant every bit of it, and a kitchen that filled up, meal by meal, with something none of the three of them were quite ready to name yet. Maybe you already know what that something turns out to be. Maybe you're sitting there thinking about your own kitchen table, and who sat at it with you through the hardest year of your life without saying much of anything. Because sometimes the staying says it all on its own. I'd love to know if you'd been on that platform the day Elsa stepped off the train, still not knowing what she was walking into. What would you have done in her place? Would you have turned around and gotten back on that train? Or would you have counted the storefronts and knocked on that door, same as she did? Tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and tell me what you'd have done. If this one found its way to you and it landed somewhere true, hit like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one.